Hey, Jen, what's happening? Thanks for linking up today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here.
I am so excited for this conversation and share it with our listeners. We're going to get into the weeds on movement and posture because there's always talks about movement and posture, and it's so polarizing. And you're supposed to move this way, you're not supposed to move this way. How do I get perfect military posture? All these things. So again, thank you for committing some time for us today.
Happy to be here.
Can you give a little insight as to how you got to where you are?
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in doing gymnastics. So I think that in and of itself kind of lent itself to loving the weight room and just movement in general. Coming into college, I went to University of Florida. I was an exercise and sports science major. So I spent a lot of time in the strength and conditioning space. But like many, you kind of get to the end and it's like, do I really want to go that route? Or do I want to push a little bit harder and maybe look into some medical side? So I love sports medicine. I was kind of at this crossroads of, I really had a philosophy more in line with physical therapy. But this was 2002 and PTs didn't have direct access to patients, right? You had to get your script from your medical doctor. You couldn't do MRIs, you couldn't do x-rays. So there's much more of a limited scope. And I thought, man, it'd be great just to be able to get somebody off the street. I can kind of control the narrative at the beginning to figure out, do I need to refer or can I control this on my own? Can I order some imaging to help me out? And so I went the chiropractic route. And you can imagine I was like the redheaded stepchild in school of like, yes, but, or I don't believe that, or, always raising a hand and kind of having a rebuttal. But I do think I came out on the other side with a very different perspective. And within that, I filled in a lot of gaps with kind of your typical courses outside, Mulligan and active release and FMSs and those sorts of things. So when I came out and having the background in strength and conditioning, I kind of moved in nicely to University of California, San Diego. They were much more ahead of their time in that they had a chiro on staff. So that was me, but I still got to interact with strength and conditioning and PT and athletic training. And so, really love kind of the multidisciplinary approach. I worked with all sports there except for football, which being at 5'2", bodes well. So really grew a fondness for, I'd say the golf and, tennis, baseball and softball. So that's where that rotational side started to develop. And then from collegiate sector, moved into the private side in San Diego. It was a sports performance facility, already had a PT group in there. We got really close and connected in terms of a business plan, and we opened up 5 more locations in San Diego. So spent a lot of time on the private side there as well. Within that, we already worked with a lot of the Padres. So this opportunity came up where the PT for the Padres ended up leaving. They brought our group into the organization. So I sold my businesses on the private side, was solely working with the Padres then. And then from there, took about a year off to have a baby, moved to Florida for more family help. And then from there, ended up working for the Minnesota Twins. And in that position, again, same thing. I had a kind of a split role where I was strength and conditioning, but I was also sports medicine. And in my mind, like it's always this kind of blend from one to the next. So I liked being able to get my hands in both and not having to be kind of pigeonholed one or the other. And spent a number of years there until it kind of made sense where I just wanted to be back in the private side, have a little more control in my schedule. And with that, I ended up accumulating some players that just wanted help outside the organization. And so that's what I do now. I have very kind of high level package of performance that I offer to baseball players. I have some other athletes in there as well. And I travel to them in season, programming, manual therapy, kind of all the above to help them in their journey. So that's where we are. University of Florida, correct? Yes. Go Gators. Go Gators. Basketball tournament. Hello.
I was about to say congratulations. My older brother is a Gators fan and my wife is a Auburn Tigers fan. So there was some banter going on during the tournament this year.
Yeah. Let's say it was a pleasant win, a pleasant surprise of a win, I should say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Bring Florida back to their winning ways.
There you go.
You mentioned baseball. When did you first start? What year, if you can remember, was first year into baseball?
Well, like I said, at UCSD, I started there in 2006. So I was working with multiple teams, right? But had my taste of baseball then. I'd say it was probably right around 2010 that I really started to work more specifically with baseball. I had some quarterbacks in there too, being in that facility. But the baseball was real heavy there, and then moved into the Padres around, I think it was 2016, somewhere around there.
Okay. So really curious, right? I always love asking this question for folks that have been in sports for a while. And you've been in there both on the team setting and private side, right? 2010, it's now 2025, right? Almost 15 years ago, first real taste of the team side. Yeah. How has the environment of working in the team environment in baseball back then versus now, like, could you speak upon kind of how it's just evolved over time?
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see from the player perspective, how it used to be taboo to walk into a training room. right? Those guys would never go in there unless there was something obviously wrong. There was nothing with regard to, or very minimal, I should say, recovery, right? Or manual techniques to kind of help speed up the process, especially for, let's say, a starting pitcher who has to be back every 5 days to start. Whereas today, it's much more commonplace for that athlete to go in after the game just to get some soft tissue work done, or maybe they're using some BFR technology, right? Or they're doing some sort of recovery exercise to recapture certain positions. So there's this shift, I think, in mentality from the player side of, no, I want to go in there so I can get better and recover faster, right? And hopefully stay out of the training room in terms of being injured, right? And in that sense, it really kind of boosts what sports medicine and the performance staff is doing. And they really see the value, I think, in those people to help provide those supportive, things for the player. So that's been a big shift in my mind.
Was there one thing that like maybe surprised you, or reality you kind of had a reality check once, working in it? Like maybe most folks don't understand or can experience things in a team side. We see a lot of things from the outside in. Sports are in the limelight. Whereas there one reality or one thing that surprised you that most people don't understand unless you actually are in it?
Yeah, I'd say especially going from the private side, where in my model, I had an hour to work with everybody, right? You did your assessment, you had some manual stuff, and then you work your way into the weight room and make that transition. When I got into the professional setting, I maybe had 10, 15 minutes with a player. Like just the resources, the number of us compared to players, especially when you're in the minor league system, they have 200 plus players. The amount of time that you can physically spend with somebody is so minimal. And so you really have to be, okay, to the point, what's the most important thing that I can do today for you? But on the same rate, I never felt like I was providing the full value that I could provide or get a player to a certain place that I needed to. Then there's the internal politics of, hey, this guy's a prospect. We can spend a little bit more time with him, but that guy, not so much. And I have a problem with that just personally, right? It's like, but he needs this, So that was a big kind of eye-opening experience to me with regard to just the limitations in time, resources, and then the ethical piece behind some of those decisions.
Having spent 15 years on the team side, I have fully embraced I get 60 to 90 minutes with someone right now and can do a lot of those things. Like you said, add value. Like there's so many times working on the team side, you felt, what did I even do today? Like I rubbed this guy's foot and ankle for 10 minutes. I got this guy for a gun and a stretch, made sure this guy did his ISOs before he got on the court. And that was all within 60 minutes. And now I'm just watching a 2.5 hour practice, right? It's like, but it's so I won't say unusual, but you just don't know it. Like I said, you just don't know unless you're in it. And so I appreciate you calling that out. And I share the same sentiment. It definitely was.
Yes.
How can I provide more, but I can't, right?
Right. You got it.
So baseball is a sport I've never worked in, nor have I worked tennis, nor have I worked golf. And these are some sports that you work in. And I find them unique in the sense that in comparison to sports that I've been mostly close with, soccer and basketball, right? You have more open field, more open skill activities in those team sports versus tennis, golf, baseball, more like we refer to a close skill, like a pitching, hitting. There's a start and a stop to the movement, right? I want to dive into baseball because I know that's where you're really focusing on. And so there are two key elements, right? Hitting and pitching. From your perspective, why or how do these two elements make baseball unique in comparison to other sports like soccer or basketball?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, it's a high level of skill, right? Throwing a baseball, I look at it more as a skill. And the level of precision that these guys have to have, whether it's trying to hit a ball that's coming at them 95 miles an hour with this little stick, right? Or they're trying to paint the zone, right, on the corner with a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. There's a level of detail that comes with that I think some of these other sports just aren't as detailed, right? And so when those adjustments or there's that much detail, when a player loses the ability, let's say in a hand, for a hand to be able to pronate or supinate, that's the difference of them, cutting the ball, which is the ball kind of like coming in a certain direction that they don't have necessarily control over, or just not them being able to find, where that pitch usually lands. Or with a hitter, a lot of it's maybe like the timing gets thrown off. And now there's no way they're going to be able to hit that ball. So like the adjustments that you have to make, they're in this the small window that, and even with golf, I think you can appreciate the same thing with golf, right? Like you change the face of the club just by, a degree and the shots totally change. So the level of detail that I think goes hand in hand with golf and baseball from a hitting and pitching perspective is a bit higher than I think with some of the other sports, which is where we come along, being able to make those adjustments in movement, right? Capabilities. What do they have access to, or what are they losing? How do you help the player with those things?
So there's one word you hit on, and there's another word I've already mentioned, and I know you know very well, and that's movement and then posture. And we're going to talk about those two words a lot as it relates to, like you said, skill as it relates to performance. So before we even start going down this path of movement, posture, performance, I would love to hear your definition or how you view posture and movement.
Yeah. Well, if you would have asked me in chiropractic school about posture, I would have said it's a bunch of bullshit. Excuse me. BS, but it's funny because that's what a lot of chiros kind of hang their hat on. It always kind of bothered me because there's no perfect posture, right? I mean, we can take, for example, I work with some high level swimmers. And if you look at most swimmers, they kind of look like a Dorito in terms of like their shoulders, but then this like human cashew that's been pulled forward, right? In terms of sternum being down, forward head, etc. And most people would look at that and be like, oh, that's terrible, right? Terrible, quote unquote, posture. But that's really useful for their sport. It's an adaptation, right? That's been creative. So, that was kind of old school gen. New school gen looks at posture as it's really just it's an end result of that person's structure and how they're managing gravity and their environment and things that they're doing. That's all it is, right? And position, I kind of, group in that same category. The position of things leads to the posture that you're seeing. So that would be my definition of posture. And essentially, like I said, it's a very useful tool to understand how that person is managing everything around them, from internal forces, external forces, their activity, et cetera.
We're gonna save some of these like questions I really want to get to, because I want to ask Jen these like clickbait questions, but we're not going to get there yet. I share the same sentiment on the posture side. It's like it's an aggregate of what is being asked of them, and then what are they currently doing. Because like this is like the classic example that I always think about is the desk jockey, the desk jockey posture. Sure. That got bastardized. It's like, that's bad posture. It's like, right. I'm sorry, you sit at your desk 8 hours a day. I don't want to sit up straight. I want to hunch down and let me just hang out here with my elbows on the desk. Like that's energy saving. Like I want to do that, right? So to use a very crude example, like I always say this idea, like posture's not good or bad, it just is.
It is.
And then it's just and then it's just understanding, okay, posture always tells a story. And I know you know that. Posture tells a story. Okay, hypertrophy tells a story. Why and how is this posture being the way it is in front of me? And so this is going to be fun.
That was well said. I might steal that.
Feel free. But right, like, and maybe I should double back here, right? Chiropractic school first. I'm a physical therapist, and in hindsight, I wish I had the fortitude or the vision that you had is like, well, I can't get direct access. I can't order imaging, right? Right now as a physical therapist, I still rely on a lot of physicians to do a lot of things for me because I don't have some of those abilities that you have. So again, I wish, I wish I had thought of that previously, but I didn't. So hopefully we get to Arizona. We can order imaging here soon.
There you go.
Posture and movement are big things that physical therapists love to pride themselves on. The classic books of, Kendall, Sarman, they did fantastic work. Go back into some of those texts and the way it's taught, and then you kind of come up with the lens that we're coming at. They've been talking about this stuff for years. It's just the way we're communicating has been different. So I think it's fascinating to always hear how people view these things that talk about, and maybe we'll get to it. It's just movement, and maybe more so the idea of, the dichotomy of, oh, that's good movement, that's bad movement, that's right, that's wrong. Would love to hear your perspective on when those topics of conversation come up. How do you approach them?
Yeah, I'm going to steal your line. Like, movement just is, right? Again, it's a reflection of what you have access to, right? It's a reflection of the postures and positions that you have and how that is going to, be able to change. Maybe it can't change. And that's what you're seeing as a reflection of, quote unquote, dysfunctional or not pretty, or, what we would classify as bad movement. So I don't necessarily look at it as good or bad, right? Again, it just is. I'll give an example, which is, sometimes when I'm working with a pitcher and I'm looking at their mechanics and I'm like, oh, it doesn't look pretty. But then there's this aspect of it that, okay, it's very deceptive to the hitter. And that deception is what makes that pitcher so great. And if I try and pretty that movement up or change it, Now all of a sudden that pitcher loses the deception. He's not as effective. And now he's not even in the major leagues anymore, right? So it's not as black and white as people like to make it out to be. Now, certainly coming from, the health and wellness lens, we look at it and say, man, there's a lot of focal loading that's happening at this joint. And I realized that, man, it really gives him the great deception or the certain movement on the ball. But the question is, how long is that going to last? And that's the lens that I have to look at it through. And then again, there's no black and white answer, because he have made some sort of connective tissue that is more robust than the next guy. So this guy can pitch 8 years on doing that. But the guy next to him who's doing the same thing that doesn't have the same connective tissue quality or properties, he's going to break down after a year, right? So this is where injury, mechanics, movement, it becomes really muddy because there is no black and white.
And that's the hardest thing, and the question I heard you ask yourself and then you answered it was should I intervene or not? Mm-hmm. And this is where you talk about the politics or the ethics of things is when you're working with someone, you have to do something. Right? You're being paid to do something, whether that's by the team or by the player privately. So, okay, well, just because I have to do something, does that mean I have to fix something? Right. Or do I have to change something? Or we feel I changed his movement. I improved his rotation in his shoulder or his hip. I mean, I had a buddy in baseball tell me, high level thinker, he would say, hey, we got this player. We thought we wanted to chase improving internal rotation at his hip. And a couple of weeks later, he said, guys, I am just not hitting the ball with as much pop anymore. And they said, okay, let's back off. His hip got stiff again. Now you put him on the table and you'd say, wow, this is an ugly looking hip. It's stiff. It's not moving well. He starts hitting the ball with exit velocity off the bat's going back up. Totally. And so you just you look at these things and you say, the old adage of if it's not fixed, if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Yeah.
And then at some point, I appreciate you saying, at some point though, there's probably going to have to be an intervention. And in sports and orthopedics, it's usually when symptoms and injuries arise, or the same patterning of symptoms and injuries keep coming up, whether that's on the same side of the body, the same type of tissue, the same type of joint, or the same type of tissues keep getting hurt. It's okay, we're starting to see a pattern and something has to give. And that's where you talk about, those that play on for 15, 20 years. Yes, it's a part of they're doing it because they do all the right things, but there's also some elements, you look at some of those athletes. I've been fortunate to work with a few that have played 18, 20 plus years in their sport. And you get them on the table and you look at it's I don't need to do anything. You're good, right?
Yeah.
And so they just also happen to have that, let's just say genetics, if you want to play it, or how they present themselves. They are one of the fortunate ones. So all those things considered, there's a lot of different ways we can go with this. And I think where I want to go is when you hear the idea of, should I or should I not intervene? I think it's important we kind of double click there, because in the space that you work, where you have the close skill of pitching and hitting, I think you yourself, and especially with that type of athlete, what I've learned from being around baseball players, they're so in tune with the subtlest details. I'd really love to hear your perspective of when should or should I not intervene on something?
Yeah. I mean, I'm fortunate in that when a player comes to me, we're usually dealing with, there's something in the mechanics that's been pointed out, let's say from a pitching coach. And I work hand in hand with these guys to understand what they're seeing and what they're trying to change. So either they're coming to me for some sort of a mechanical kind of performance sort of change, or maybe there's just an injury history there that they just can't seem to get around. Right. And how are we dealing with that? I don't think I've ever had a player yet that's I'm good, but I'm just here, But I will say, I do have a couple players that they're always operating in the top 95%, right? There's not a lot that we're trying to change with them, but it's keeping them there. Right. So as you would expect, they have their outing. And as a result of forced production, fatigue, et cetera, you see measures trickle off. Right. And the question is can we get those measures back? And having worked with these guys for years now, you kind of have this zone of where they operate best. Right. That's what I'm always trying to get back to. And then obviously use their feedback to say yeah, that made a good change in my back hip. I was able to hold that backside a little bit longer. Or I can feel that my torso is opening up a little bit better, and it felt a little restricted beforehand, right? So it kind of depends on who the player is. But at this point in the game, there's usually something mechanically that we're trying to try and manipulate to help in performance. There's something from hey, we just got to keep an eye on this guy keeps going down with something. How do we maybe catch it before it becomes a problem? Or this kind of like upper zone of trying to maintain that quality of movement, performance, et cetera, whatever that means for that player.
I'm curious, is there a age that you're seeing, or maybe like, just like, I know it's short, but like the clients that you have, is there like an average age amongst them, or is it a pretty wide gap?
No, I mean, the baseball guys are kind of all in that zone of, 24 to 30. That's kind of like, I would say, round about their prime-ish. So that would be the zone for baseball. I have a couple of professional level swimmers that are 18, so they're a little bit more on the younger side. But most of the athletes I work with are probably in that kind of 20-ish to 30 range.
Okay. Because I was curious, like just thinking you hear this awareness of their body and what works for them and what doesn't. And I just wonder, like, does that just come with age and time? Like, you're probably, like, I think back to my time, like the guys that needed more work and knew what didn't work were the ones that had more years under their belt, whereas the young bucks were maybe not aware of how their body was moving or what they were doing, or the mileage hadn't caught up to them yet. So I was just curious, like, if you observed or noticed anything on that side.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think the players that are on that older-ish end, 28, 29, 30, they've had more experience with working with individuals, and they know what it takes to kind of get back, and then more the younger ones. I will say that between pitchers and position players, the pitchers are far more dialed in on like the smallest thing, tiny thing. The hitters, not as much. Every once in a while you get a hitter that is, but man, pitchers, there's just something about that sort of mentality, the qualities that you have to have for a pitcher that align with being very in tune with the smallest changes. Yeah.
I think you could probably pick a position in every sport, that like team sport, that's like that. Like
that's a good point.
In basketball, it's the point guard.
Yeah.
The point guards are just like, they may be something more athletic folks, but like their cognitive abilities are much higher because what they have to do for their position.
Yep. Like quarterbacks in the same boat.
I imagine quarterbacks are the same way. And soccer, this is kind of the other end of the continuum. The goalkeepers are just nuts because they're like,
really?
I just have to throw my body at people. They also have a very unique perspective of, they always see the entire field from behind the point, the point of play. So that's why like keepers can really read a game and understand it really well, because they just see everything. Whereas like other players are kind of just in it, so you can't always see things.
There's always one position that's just a little different. Yeah.
It's absolutely words and things I've heard you talk about so far, kind of like manual therapy, position, exercise, strength training, right? I think, a lot of us are, you're a sports chiropractic, sports physical therapist, manual therapy, stretching, exercise, kind of three main tools in our toolbox. When you start talking about how we may want to leverage those three, both in the medical end of the continuum, but then also the performance end of the continuum, I would love to just hear you kind of express your perspective of how and when to utilize those. Let's talk about, more on the medical side. I always talk about manual therapy, stretching, exercise. How are you leveraging those tools on the medical side to improve some of these positional changes or quality of movement?
Yeah, I think one, obviously your assessment is going to dictate where things are and where you need to go. Right? Do I need to get length on a certain side? Okay, what does that mean? Does that mean I need to decrease the motor output in a certain muscle that just doesn't want to seem to let go? Okay, well, what does that mean? Do I need to put a needle in that? Do I need to use some sort of manual technique, a hand or a cup or, a joint mobilization, right? So again, those are just the tools to accomplish the task of whatever you're seeing from your assessment, from a positional standpoint. Obviously, your table tests, et cetera, are going to tell you where you need to go there. So, manual, I'm big on, just because obviously that kind of was my upbringing. And if I can get something in a couple seconds, I'm going to use that to then obviously be able to move the show along. And then I look at exercises as, okay, how do I set this up to basically give me a position or give me a shape that they cannot make on their own? And maybe that's leveraging the ground to help me out, or it's using a wall or some sort of tool to be able to teach them what that is. And this is where, again, this is kind of where I had a lot of beef with chiropractic, which was just like, oh, you just do this adjustment and then you send them on their way. And I was like, but you didn't teach them anything, right? Like, great, you got something to move, you got something to change, but then they're going to go kind of right back to what they know, right? So that's where obviously the exercise piece is huge, because you have to teach them a different strategy from what they were doing. And that strategy is where that carries over. And that carryover is where you create the change. So it's this continuum of, I have to get maybe a certain shape that I'm looking for, a certain position that I'm looking for, and I'm using maybe manual skills to get there. Then I'm backing it up with an exercise to teach them. And then I'm putting them in a more upright position to start to create more, of a challenge to their system so that it uploads and they're able to hang on to that. So that's how I approach it from the sports medicine side. And to be honest, I don't think there's much of a difference, from the weight room. Because for me, it's like, okay, I did this sort of manual on them. How do I recreate that with a lacrosse ball or a foam roller or some sort of a stick, right? That they can then try and do the same thing on their own. So when I'm not there, they can do that. Then again, they go back through the exercises, and that's how we get things to stick and change. And then obviously through their actual lift, which again, there's a lot of carryover in what you're trying to change there too. So I don't look at it as two separate things, which is why I think it would be hard for me to be pigeonholed into sports medicine or strength and conditioning, because for me, it's all one and the same.
It's either can you put your hands on someone or not, and then can they ride the bike with or without you is
Yes.
really what you're trying to get after, right? And I always joke, it's I'm trying to almost trying to talk myself out of a job sometimes. Like I don't want you to rely on me. Like
Totally.
but the way I view the manual therapy side is like the training wheels on the bike or I have to show you how to ride the bike, because a lot of the manual therapy, aside from the recovery massage and just trying to get them to down regulate, like there's that whole other world of the manual therapy side. But relative to what we're talking about, like movement and posture, I really view the manual therapy side of, I'm trying to teach you what it's like to feel something that you don't know how to feel yourself, right? Like, how do I get this muscle? I need to teach you how to let this muscle relax. I need to teach you, this is what it feels like to load a hip or loaded knee, right? Like I think if you would ever watch one of my like training sessions, like I'm constantly putting my hands on knees or hips. It's like, no, like I need you to feel it here. I need you to shift your weight over here. Like the tactile cues are so powerful. Like that's where tying in, if you can tie in what you're doing on the table to then what they're doing and standing in the weight room, it's like, man, like now, like you don't need me anymore. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And so like, I think that's what I was hearing you say. And then you beautifully segued into the weight room, which you cross that line of, all right, now I'm going to start talking about exercise programming in the weight room. And so I'd love to hear your perspective of like where exercise fits within the performance programming, because if you're trying to improve movement quality, that may not always fall in line with trying to improve traditional way of thinking of performance metrics.
Sure. Yeah. So, for me, I almost like looking at it from the lens of off season to spring training to in season, right? Because that kind of follows that sort of timeline, which is when a player comes off of a full season, you do your initial assessment and it usually looks like garbage. Their bodies are pretty beat up at that point, right? So it's like, we're not going to jump right back into, force production and power, right? The goal at that point is to recapture a lot of things, right? And so those sorts of exercises in the weight room are going to be much different than what you would think from a traditional strength training lens. Now, it's not like we're doing stretching and yoga and Pilates, which, don't get me wrong, like there's definitely a time and a place for those things. These guys are still in the gym, but we're using, cables, dumbbells, round contacts, maybe a slower tempo on a squat with, box helping certain things, right? We're still in a weight room and lifting, but the intentionality of where the center of gravity is, the rate of force development, how I'm shifting things from right to left, I'm using those things to help recapture and restore what was taken away during the season. So that would be my weight room strategy, come the first part of the off season. As we've recaptured those movements and we're in a place where, okay, now I can start driving more force production, which will inherently take away some of that relative motion. That's okay, because we've kind of built this buffer in at the very beginning, right? So now we can transition into more of that force production and get into more of what we would consider the traditional things in the weight room, and then build, some power as we start to get into spring training. So that concept still applies in season. Because even in season, if I'm looking at a player and the assessment tells me that, okay, we're really losing a lot of things here. Either I can keep pushing you in the weight room and we're going to take away some of those things or not improve it, or I can pull back in the weight room and we can start to recapture a little bit and get what we need before driving you forward again so that you're on the field. Right. So that mentality still applies in season based on what you're seeing from your assessment. So am I pulling my foot off the gas and helping to restore some movement options and movement quality, or am I putting my foot on the pedal and pushing you more towards the strength and power continuum because we can and we need to? So what does that player need in that point in time?
I would love to hear your perspective on this question. The idea of injury prevention, injury risk reduction, right? There's a lot of smart folks in the world of high performance and sports science that are always trying to chase this, right? Like this is the holy grail. How can I guarantee I'm going to reduce injury risk by X amount of percentage? And so, three things that always tend to kind of come up in the research are, how strong you are, right? Tends to correlate with getting injured less. Your level of fitness and how you assess that is probably specific to every sport, but some level, let's for the sake of this conversation, let's label strength as, back squat strength. Fitness is defined as a direct or proxy measure of VO2 max. And then the third thing that always comes up is level of asymmetry in movement, right? Those things tend to really, all three of those, if you can, optimize those three holistically, you tend to reduce injury risk. What I'm hearing you say is, how much do I need to step on the gas or, step on the brake relative towards any one of those three? One question I field a lot is, how much do I chase movement? And then how much do I chase those KPIs? Because it's really hard to measure movement, but it's easier to measure those things, right? How do you manage that conversation around injury risk reduction relative to everything you just described around movement quality, regaining and capturing those positions versus chasing the other things that are more external that have in current society have been withstood the test of time within the research?
Yeah. And this is where, that's a great question. And this is where I think it's so hard to answer. And I don't think we've quite answered it yet, because even just talking about strength, right? Strength is relative to the person you have in front of you and what they have to accomplish with regard to their sport and the position they play within their sport, right? Because if I have an athlete, I'm just going to take two pictures here. CC Sabathia, who was this large human, right, that threw a baseball 95 miles an hour. And then you take someone like a Chris Sale, who's kind of more of this like twiggy, very whippy sort of pitcher, right? The strength needs for both of them are going to be different. They deliver the baseball at 95 miles an hour, both of them, but they do it two totally different ways. And, thanks to, Bill Hartman and his kind of archetypes and understanding what these narrow and wide structures have access to and the way they do things, the Sabathia, I'm going to make sure I have, quote unquote, enough strength that he can accomplish that task, because that's what his bias is more towards that force production piece. And then if I have someone like a Chris Sale, who's this more narrower, whippy, he uses more end ranges of rotation. Velocity is really how he gets down the mound to deliver the baseball at 95 miles an hour. If I push him too far down the strength continuum, I actually take some things away that he may need in terms of delivering the baseball at 95 miles an hour. We set him up for more compensatory movements because I'm not training him within the scope of what he needs to be trained in. And now I've created a problem because I have driven more strength with him. So it's like you can't layer on the same strength qualities and tests with these two different athletes. So that's why it's such a hard question to answer, which is, well, how strong is strong enough for this particular player with that structure in this sport in that position? So there's that piece of the equation. So you have to understand, well, what does this athlete need for them in terms of strength? And that's going to be a different answer for everybody, right? We can't paint everyone with the same broad brush, which is why we don't have that answer in the literature to say you have to have this sort of a, thigh pull and you're okay, or you have to test this way and, name ERI or the shoulder, you name it, right? So there's that piece. When you come to look at movement quality and asymmetry, again, that's a hard one to answer because certain asymmetries can be helpful, especially in baseball or golf, right? When they're doing something one-sided, I take that asymmetry away and guess what? They're not good anymore, right? So again, what is the symmetry that's needed for that particular player? And I think this is where, again, that kind of high level of service, I've been working with these players for so long, and I know this asymmetry on right versus left, this is actually where he operates best, right? I don't want to actually even that out. However, if that asymmetry gets too pronounced, we see this kind of shoulder start barking a little bit, right? So again, it's very N equals 1. And that's why we will never have this answer of these blanket sort of measures or these blanket sort of strength, requirements. This is going to be where we need to get all of these guys. It's just not going to happen. Did I answer that okay?
Absolutely.
Did I hit every point there?
No, like you're challenging a lot of traditional thinking in the sense of, we're all when you think about what we have to do, like what we live in, whether it's the chiropractor, physical therapist, strength coach, we all fit into one of two buckets. You're either trying to improve performance, which usually is involved in reducing injury risk, or you're trying to build somebody back up because they've had some sort of symptom of injury. And so when you have, everyone's trying to do one of those two things for the, let's just say 90% of it, right? So when that's the undertone of what we're after, I hear you say, and I understand, it doesn't matter about the other output, because ultimately I need to make sure you don't get hurt again, because if you keep doing these things the way you're doing them, or we keep running into these issues, we may run into more injury. Then I hear the performance side of, I need to show that I'm making positive changes with this athlete. I need to show that they're getting stronger, they're getting faster, they're building more fitness. I hear that. I lived that in my early part of my career working on the fitness side of soccer. It's like, what am I doing here if I'm not making improvements, right? Like the team loses. Oh gosh, Jen, I remember this one time in my career, we lost 8 of 9 games. And in soccer, that's about 2.5 months of losing. Man, like after like week 5, week 6, like every Monday morning, coach comes in, Adam, our team's not fit. Adam, our team's not fit. Adam, our team's not fit. Right. And that's a very real thing that happens, right? Yeah. Like we always got to look at like, okay, our team, how can we just, so for me, like in that space, I'm like, I got to do more. I got to figure out like, how do I improve recovery? How do I improve fitness? Versus like you on the other hand, is like, whoa. Like, can we just slow down here? Like, I don't want these guys to get more load and just like increase these compensations. And now we start having more injuries. So I think it's just really hard to, like you said, really hard to say everybody should be here. Everybody should be there. And at the same time, like you and I are in a unique space now where we both get to work in the private space with one-on-one guys for a large volume. If I was in the team, and you said earlier, like in the team setting, you just can't do that. So then the question I'm trying to ask, or where I'm trying to get to, is like, how can we support those that are on the team side, or those that don't have the flexibility or not even flexibility, the ability to get in the nuances on this, because they're going to still have to have some standards, to have some accountability. Like, how do you support that perspective?
It's no doubt it's tough, right? I do give presentations to some of these Major League Baseball teams, and that's certainly a question that pops up all the time. We got 250 guys. You're talking about these minute details. How do we even make that effective, right? Or an option. And when I look back and I say, what's been the biggest change maybe in the last 5 years that has changed the way I program, or changed the way I evaluate, or take that evaluation and apply what I'm finding, or looking at it from a performance aspect, when I'm trying to improve these sort of metrics, what are some of the things that now I'm looking at through a totally different lens? And I would have to say the archetypes are a big one, right? Because if you're chasing something with, let's say, a very narrow athlete who, again, like not designed for a lot of force production, if you're chasing something with that particular player and you're going down the wrong route completely, like clearly that's never going to be an effective route. It may create some issues, right? Or you maybe get a little bit of gain and then things fall off. So for me, just being able to look at and identify structural biases to understand, okay, we can really push this guy in the weight room, and we need to, because here's what we're seeing. Or, man, we really pushed this guy in the weight room. He's very narrow. And maybe we actually took away, this was actually a case that happened when I was with the Minnesota Twins. And he's a client of mine now. We had this 6'9" pitcher, like hello basketball, right? 6'9" pitcher. He is the tallest, I believe, starting pitcher in Major League Baseball. And you cannot treat him the way you treated everybody else. And so, he was brought to my attention. He was actually one of the few players that they allowed me to invest time and just like, hey, we've been driving him for more force production. We've been doing a lot of trap bar. We've been squatting and blah, 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 blah. He's gotten stronger, but velo's gone down. And it's like, how does that happen? Right? So again, peeling back, and this was in my very early stages of understanding what these two archetypes were, I was like, we have to try something different here. This traditional route of how we train most of our players is not working for this guy. And in fact, he hasn't put together a healthy season yet. He's always gone down with some elbow issue or back problem, whatever. And his velo's only gone down. We had jump mats then. We didn't have force plates. So it's like his jump scores have gone down, right? So it's like, how do these metrics go down when we've been driving everything we thought was right in the weight room? And, lo and behold, looking at it, like really flipping it upside down and saying, you know what? I'm going to pull him off of trap bar. I'm going to put him more on single leg, split squat, bounding, med ball, right? These sort of more rotational elements within the weight room, more velocity-based activities versus, high load, slow movement, et cetera. And what we found was we restored a lot of rotational capabilities with the guy, which made sense being how narrow and tall he was. As a result, jump scores ended up going up because we were able to capture actually more internal rotation through certain activities. And as a result, we took his velo from 88 to 93, right? So again, like, if you can understand what are these two kind of different athletes that I have here, and if I can maybe direct the programming a little bit more intentional with regards to these guys versus those guys, even though we're both trying to improve 95-mile-an-hour fastball, right? We get there kind of through different ways. Maybe that helps a team just separate things out a little bit, and they increase their ability to have successful outcomes.
The example I'm also hearing, like that first came to mind was people love, nowadays, like the standard is like force plates and counter movement jump. And people, we love to bucket them as either, are you force dominant or velocity dominant? All right, just based on your CMJ score. And what I'm hearing you say relative to baseball too is like you're saying they both get to 95 miles an hour, but they get there two different ways. Same thing, jumping. You can both jump 40 centimeters. One may have more concentric peak power, right? Their ability to utilize muscle strength and force production, where the other one is more like, no, like they have really good transition and eccentric qualities and they're just elastic, right?
Right. There you go.
But they both jump, right? So are you seeing a similar kind of like profiling system within like what you just alluded to as well?
That's a really good question. This is where, when I left the Twins that year, they actually got force plates. So I didn't have access to, unfortunately, seeing that out. But to your point, from people that do have them, I don't have them in my, place where I train. But to your point, the people that do have seen those sorts of qualities, right? Of more elasticity, to your point, a higher peak power on the bottom, right? So unfortunately, I don't have that data, but that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I like, and you kind of beat me to the punchline of the question. I wanted to ask, like, what's kind of then one thing that's maybe really have you pivot on, right? You've been doing this for quite a while now, and you go through stages of your career and you go through phases. And at some point you probably look back and say, shit, like that was an inflection point for me. And I was just curious over the last 5 years, like, has there been one of those moments? And it sounded like there was.
100%. Yeah. I think it's funny and I'm sure you've kind of done this too, which is coming out of school, I was like, oh yeah, FMS, SFMA, like it made sense. Like it gave me some sort of a pathway to figure things out. And then you start to get to a point where like, yeah, but I'm still not solving this, right? How do I get this? So then I kind of like shifted gears and I was like DNS, and I did DNS for years. I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like now I'm getting this. And then I shifted gears and it was like PRI, right? Or it was ART and then it was needling. It didn't matter what it was, right? All of those things are right. And all of those things are wrong, right? There's no perfect technique or philosophy. I use all of them, right? But I think the inflection point for me was going back and listening to Bill Hartman. And I just remember being like, what is this guy even talking about right now? I was like, I had to listen to something 10 times before I could actually understand like the vocabulary and what he was referring to. But there was something that like grabbed me that I was like, I hate listening to it, but I have to listen to it. Through understanding his model, that was the inflection point to say, this is why SFMA worked really well in this case, but not in this one. Or that's why DNS was really applicable here. Or PRI, that's why PRI solved this, but it didn't do that. And so it's through his model and through this lens of looking at things in a very different light that I'm able to see how each of these things is useful and how each of these things will fail if not understanding archetypes, internal dynamics, where somebody is at that point in time, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a huge inflection point for me.
Now I have a really difficult question that I'm going to ask, and I'll see if you can handle it. Each one of those, and this isn't I want to be very clear, this is not a marketing ploy for anybody or bringing down anybody. All right. Sure. You and I have learned all models are useful, but they're all wrong at some level. And I heard you just describe a lot of different common models, frameworks that a lot of health and performance people subscribe to. I would be really curious, what have you found? Like, we talk about buckets of people. What have you found? Maybe let's just pick three popular ones: SFMA, FMS, DNS, PRI. Where have you, SFMA, FMS is really good for this type, but then DNS really helps me out with like this type, and PRI really helps me out with that. Like, did you even look at your clients or the history and say, yeah, I could answer that, or is that too difficult to answer?
It's a really tough one. I could probably dance around it a little bit in certain ways. The PRI model, from what I've seen, works really well for your more narrow individuals. So we talked about kind of the two different archetypes of one having this kind of wider base versus a narrow base, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the PRI model fits more of what I've seen from that narrow archetype, right? From like an evaluation, even like their exercises that they prescribe, et cetera. DNS standpoint's pretty interesting. I think where I go to a lot of the DNS stuff is when I'm starting to use exercises that are very much ground-based, right? I think they did a really good job of understanding and looking at development from a baby's perspective, right? And understanding, well, why did they go here next? And what sort of contacts are they using in terms of medial elbow inside of the knee? And why do they come up to this position next? So I think those concepts work really well when understanding how to kind of build movement from developmental on the floor, then standing up sort of thing. I think FMS, SFMA, I think they do like a good job of like, for me, it's like a 60% solution, right? It's going to catch some of the big things. And maybe that works really well when you have a lot of athletes and you're trying to do just some sort of a screen to kind of really flag the big ones that need some of your help. You know, I like some of their concepts with regards to rolling patterns that again kind of stems from a lot of PNF stuff. It's all stolen in some way, shape, or form. You know what I mean? I think they did a nice job of starting to lay out, okay, how does a foot connect up to a shoulder? Right? What is that sort of chain of events that can lead from A to B? So again, like they each have their own, you know, things that are useful. That's probably the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah, no, it's a hard question. I would agree with a lot of what you said. And I would really love to double click on the PRI side of it, just from like, okay, really on the narrow side. But let me double on those. Like you're right. When we say DNS, first of all, DNS, dynamic neuromuscular stabilization is what we're referring to. DNS comes out of the Prague school. So that's, you know, if folks that are unfamiliar, that's what we're referring to. SFMA, FMS, functional movement screen, selective functional movement assessment. Gray Cook did a fantastic job with that. I'm with you. I think the FMS and SFMA is really good at like tier one. Like it's going to catch the big stuff. And I look at this as like the folks that are just looking like your active adults. They just want to move. They want to have some individualization. Fantastic. The DNS side of it, I 100% agree with you. Like the ground-based activities, like do a phenomenal job. Also, just probably a topic we don't all spend enough time understanding is like how we got to where we are right now. Like all those development positions really tell a story. I always come at it also from like the motor learning degrees of freedom problem.
Yes.
You know, meaning how can I reduce degrees of freedom so you can learn and feel something? And that's where the ground-based activity is phenomenal. The PRI, the Posture Restoration Institute, it's an interesting take you had on is I find it really successful with the narrows. I didn't really hear you say like having success with the wides. PRI focuses a lot on the diaphragmatic breathing, incorporating some developmental positions, right, within their algorithm. What made you say, hey, I've had success with it more from an individual that's narrow, compressed archetype?
Yeah. And so I think, you know, where I was seeing a lot of the discrepancies, so they do that, what they call like the adduction drop test, right? And I just remember seeing, you know, it's been so long now, but I just remember seeing one side that was a certain way and it shouldn't have been. I'm like, oh, it just must be me and the way I'm testing it. But when I started to learn and understand, well, if you have two different starting conditions, right? If I have a narrow who's already biased towards more external rotation, the first move that we can talk about precession, which is like this internal kind of force that we're all managing at the end of the day. We all have this bias to kind of put this paddle out, paddle being the ilium, to kind of prevent this internal dynamic spin that's occurring. And we all kind of get pushed over to the right-hand side. That push over to the right-hand side can kind of happen in two different ways, depending on the starting condition. So if you take a pelvis that's biased towards more external rotation, the first move that pelvis can make is actually going forward and down. And that's going to be your narrow, right? But if you have a wide and the wide pelvis is already actually biased towards being down, they can't go down any farther. So the first move they have to make is actually going more up on the left-hand side. And so this more kind of oblique axis that this turn occurs on versus a narrow has this more kind of flat turn that happens in that first stage, that certainly can change position of muscle, ranges of motion of hips, and things like that. So that's what I was seeing with regards to, well, man, if when we make this first move, I should be seeing this kind of range of motion play out, and I'm not seeing that. And so that for me was like this big aha moment of, well, if you don't start from the same place, how can you end up, right, or make that first move similarly, right? So that was a big, point of understanding, in addition to the internal dynamics of the way the diaphragm is going to move in somebody that's more like a wide versus a narrow. right? Where they kind of trap certain parts of air is different. And so who knows if it's 100% correct, but I feel like it's closer to the truth because table measures assessment wise, I'm seeing that seem to match up.
Could you, and I'm regret not asking this earlier, could you briefly, in a couple sentences, explain the difference between, we said the word wide, narrow. Could you briefly, just to give a little more context to everything you just said?
Yeah. So, if we take the pelvis, for example, the wide pelvis is going to be biased toward a sacrum that has more nutation. So meaning like the tailbone is tipped up, right? The ilium are going to have more of a posterior rotation as a result. Right. That being said, the sockets, meaning the acetabulum, are going to be angled a little bit more forward, which then allows the femur to pick up more internal rotation. Right. Even just understanding the musculature on the pelvic floor, you're going to see this bias towards a pelvic floor that's able to come up easier. And if it can come up easier in a wide, that allows you to pressurize better, which is why force production is easier for them. Versus you contrast that with the narrow pelvis. This narrow pelvis, you're going to have a sacrum that's stuck more in counter nutation. So think of like tailbone tucking under. You have ilium that are more anteriorly rotated. You're going to have sockets that are going to face outward more. So they pick up more external rotation as a result. And then again, if we consider the pelvic outlet, that outlet has an easier time descending, right? So going downwards, which means they have a harder time pushing it up, which is force production. So just from a pelvic standpoint, those are some of the differences. And then you're going to see those same differences in the thorax as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So listen, I think this was a great way to highlight how movement, performance, variety of methodology, schools of thought from someone that's been living in it, clearly gone down the path of a lot of different things. So like, I want to kind of tie it all together and say, like, there's a lot of people that are listening to this saying, holy shit, Jen, like there's so much you just said that I need to go learn and or I want to do, or like, wow, I didn't think about it that way. So rather than say, go do everything, if you could leave people with one thing of advice of how, hey, here's where to start if you wanted to upgrade your own posture and movement, how would you tell them?
Yeah. So, first, let me preface it by saying I can't even believe it's been this long, but I've been doing this for 20 plus years since graduating from college, right? I've been out of school for 20 plus years, which is pretty crazy to say. And so it obviously takes time to kind of build these building blocks. Right? If you're just coming out of school, if you're, even a couple of years out, it's like nobody expects you to know everything right out of the gate. And this is a learning process, hence why they call it a practice, because you're practicing getting better, right? But I would say learn something that's interesting to you, because what I might tell you to learn and hey, take this course, that may not be interesting to you right now, or based on what you've learned thus far, you're not ready for that. So, look what's out there, talk to your colleagues, see what other people are doing. And if there's a certain thing that really talks to you right now, take that, because your interest and your drive to want to learn and practice it and go, take these classes, that's probably what's most important to make sure that you're still learning. So whatever you talk to people, look and see what they're doing, whatever kind of grabs a hold of you as far as, wow, that's really interesting, I want to learn more about that, take that, right? And then build off of that. So that's what I would say for, the clinicians and the strength coaches and whatnot out there. And as far as your own personal, if you're trying to improve your own personal movement quality and those sorts of things, first and foremost, I'd say, find a facility where you have trainers in there that are curious. They stay curious, so that they're taking classes all the time. They're interested in what they're doing. They come with a pretty complete program, meaning they're taking you through there's some sort of assessment. So they know, okay, here's what we need to work on. They're taking your goals into consideration. And then you see this kind of stepwise process of, here's what we're going to do to improve some mobility. Here's what we're going to do to improve some movement quality. Here's how we're going to improve fitness, and here's how we're going to maybe, improve strength, whatever those goals are for you. But find someone that puts that full package together and you see is dedicating themselves to continuous learning along the way.
Love it. I appreciate that, Jen. Hey, listen, if folks wanted to catch up with you, learn more from you, is there a way they could connect with you and reach out?
Yeah, Instagram is probably one of the better ways. I'll probably check that one more. I will say I'm not a huge social media person, but I am on there a little bit, I will say. So Dr. J Reiner, so DrJReiner, that's going to be my Instagram handle. It's also the same on Twitter. I refuse to call it X because I just grew up with it, Twitter. And then my website is Stay in the Game. So that's my company name is Stay in the Game, because that's what we're trying to do. So stayinthegame.com. You can certainly email me through that. as well.
Well, fantastic. We will include all that insights. And Jen, I, as always, learn from you every time we get to catch up. So thank you for sharing and entertaining some off the sheet questions. So this was fun.
No doubt. Thank you for having me, Adam. Always good stuff with you.